Hey guys, and welcome back. If you're coming straight from part one, you already know. If you're not coming from part one, let me say, today we're talking horror. Specifically, we are talking horror games. Now, we do want to talk about horror movies and we do want to talk about books, but we're going to do that in a separate podcast in a few days. Now, we're going to move on to a new topic, although it does touch base on a few things we've already said in the first part of this video. We're going to talk about what makes a good and bad horror story. I have a lot more experience with what I consider to be good and bad horror, but let's let Aegis start off here. Aegis, what do you think makes a good horror story?
So, if you've listened to part one, you've heard us ramble on about like games that we've liked and games that didn't quite hit the mark for us with regards to horror and even sometimes the story. So, clearly, it's not the easiest thing to actually capture and make grow into a good story. Uh, but one of the first things that comes to mind for story is maintaining tension consistently at a steady pace to keep the player on edge. Think back to like a scripted cutscene in a horror game. It pulls you out of the moment, so there's almost like a feeling of safety in that time. When you feel safe, the tension is eased off and you have a moment to breathe. The big thing about horror games, if you think of like Dead Space, if you could be going down a hallway and suddenly a necromorph can pop out of nowhere. You kill the necromorphs, and sometimes more spawn. You don't know where when they'll spawn, and you also want to keep pressing on to go through the level to get to a checkpoint. For me, when I was playing Dead Space, those checkpoints, I really look forward to them because when I was younger, I was completely did not like horror. It scared the hell out of me, but I knew Dead Space was a good game. I really look forward to those checkpoints, but just the anxiety of fighting more necromorphs and getting overwhelmed and just killed by them really sketched me out. So I think maintaining consistent tension to keep the player on edge is absolutely key. What do you think?
So, I have a few points. I actually walked this one through a little bit more in my head because I was trying to think. I was trying to think not only about games, but I was trying to think about what I liked in other horror entries that are not game based.
Right.
First of all, I love a good grounded horror story. I like when it's personal. I like when it's focused on the characters. In other words, there's a reason for them to feel dread. It's kind of like what you said. Doom Guy, you can see a horror game through his plot, but there's no reason for him to be scared. Um, but when you get into something like, say, Fallout, and I am going to use this example of Fallout because I think it's an example of when I think cosmic horror does work, which is very rare. You have a character who's not from a horror game, and you accidentally step into something. Um, you accidentally step into a few of the areas that are kind of horror based, and um, one of them that kind of enters my mind is the Dunwich building, and it's so isolating instantly because your character it doesn't fit the game you're playing, and you're kind of reading these personal stories. If you remember playing through the Dunwich building, it you're picking up these logs of these two people that get into the building kind of like you did, and they eventually wind up dead. I'm not going to spoil anything. Again, it's hard to talk about these things because to keep horror good, you don't want it spoiled. But they wind up dead, and you're following their personal stories of wastelanders as you're going through the same experience, and things are getting worse and worse, right? Um, and it builds up to this cosmic dread that it's never going to tell you the full story about. And it follows up on that in Fallout 4 in the Dunwich Borers. And you get the same thing. It has that tone of cosmic horror to it, but it's very personal. You're seeing ghosts in Dunwich Borers. You go into this underground mine, and it's a follow up to the story from the Dunwich building. And you're seeing these people who are being sacrificed. You see these people who don't understand what's going on, and these flashbacks of these spirits, and it's very personal. They're horrified, they're scared. Your character is just a human, but it never quite shows you the actual cosmic threat, so it doesn't get into that corniness. That's what I mean when I say I like it to be grounded and personal. I like for the stories to be something that if I was in that situation, I would be horrified. I would be scared. I wouldn't know what to do, and I can understand the character's fear.
Well,
The other
exactly.
thing,
Like, sorry, I don't know, tie in for a second. So the thing here is that I agree with you, and I think a lot of the issue, at least from my point of view, is that when you actually have a really grounded story, like you were saying, you can actually sympathize with the characters because you actually can kind of extrapolate and understand somewhat what they're going through. It feels more real. I can think of Outlast, and you're just the reporter in the hospital, Winter, and it feels real because a reporter in a like an abandoned hospital with like these really sketchy and evil guys, you know, you can actually believe that situation is happening. If you
Right,
think of something kind of like Dead Space, it is scary, but the concept of necromorphs and like alien zombies, it's a little less believable.
right, and I'd agree with that. And so yeah, and I still find Dead Space scares me because, or I found I'm trying to think of how to say it. The story of Isaac and the fact that he's an engineer that's forced into the situation that he's in, I still found it quite terrifying. But there's a couple of things about Dead Space that bothered me. I don't know how to say it. It bothered me more than others, but a lot of what scared me in Dead Space was the background story and what starts the markers off. That slow descent into insanity, that slow obsession with the marker. Um, and that was actually a good thing to bring up because it leads to my second point is I love dread and I love the threat of eternal suffering. Not love it isn't its good thing. I love it when it's a horror element. I don't personally find death that scary. It's something I've always accepted. So in a slasher, let's say, now of course I can enjoy a good slasher, but if I was going to get shot through the eye with an arrow and die in 30 seconds, I don't find it that horrifying. However, I did find that in the Nightmare on Elm Street story, there was one scene where Freddy says, he's basically getting ready to kill a guy, and the guy says what I would basically say: "Go ahead, kill me. It'll be over quickly." And Freddy basically laughs and says, "Did you know that when you die in the real world, your brain lives for 7 minutes after you die, and in 7 minutes in a dream can be years. I've got you for years." And it was like, oh, that is horrifying. Like that one scene made that movie last in my head because I always remember sitting there being like, that is awful. He is basically implying this guy is going to be tortured for years, and that bothered me. And that's actually one thing that bothers me about Halo is the implication. And again, this is a backstory thing that the flood can destroy your soul. And I know that doesn't come up in the games, but in the books, it basically says that even though the flood kill you, it's confirmed that unless like they're a very old flood form that fails to completely kill your body, you basically become part of them. You become part of their hive mind, and it goes into detail about how the Forerunners basically have these. I want to call them digital libraries of all their memories and minds. It's kind of corny, but the one thing about it that isn't corny is they basically say at one point that they can't feel the spirits of their dead that have been consumed by the flood in the library matrix that they have because it's literally corrupted their souls. It's corrupted their eternal soul. And I always found that more disturbing than the flood jumping in my face and trying to murder me in the game ever was. That threat of eternal suffering, I find that very scary. And I think horror games should implement that a little bit more because I find insta death isn't that scary. The last point I wanted to touch on, and this always broke the beginning of horror games for me, is killing off the red shirts and everyone around you first. And that's one thing I think that Fear 2 was pretty guilty of. In the first like hour, the vast majority of your compatriots get killed. And I get it. You want that isolation, you want people to feel alone. But I always found it very dumb when games come in, they introduce you to a bunch of characters, and you listen to them talk for 5 seconds, and you go, "Well, they're red shirts. I'm not going to bother listening to you. I'm not going to bother hearing from you because you're all going to be dead in 5 minutes." Like, to me, that doesn't tell a good story. If you want to separate me from people, you want to keep me alone, do it in a way that's interesting, or find a way to balance your game that I can have AI with me, or even another human character, and it doesn't take away from the game because I like character development. I like character plot. I never liked red shirts in any game. But in horror, I find it's especially egregious because they consistently try to kill off the vast majority of people in the first X amount of time. Now, unfortunately, I skirted over into our secondary part of this topic. What do you consider bad in horror, Aegis?
Well, if you think of a horror game or a horror movie, anyways, you can actually think of a couple of things. Uh, the character is usually isolated, they're by themselves, or they're in an environment where people that are there, or the player, the other NPCs, they're not quite similar to you. It's hard to put my thoughts on it, but they are distinct enough that you feel out of place in the city, whether it be you are on a mission and the people in the town don't like you, or maybe they're under some sort of a kind of like trance or control where they don't accept you and they don't like that you're there, and so you feel even more alone. It's like when you're younger in school, maybe you're not the most popular and you're in the cafeteria. The place can be crowded, but you feel very lonely because no one is with you, or you feel out of place. You know, that. But also, there's a feel of darkness in some horror games that actually really succeed, and some where it isn't there. If you think of Silent Hill, they either employ like buildings where there's like no natural light or fog, or like dark nights, where if you take it during the day, it immediately rips you out and doesn't feel as scary. All the time, like Bloodborne, it's during the day in the games. Like if you're in the brighten part of the city during the early game, it's not that scary. The enemies are there, but it doesn't quite have the same horror aspect as when it's darker, or if you're in the forest parts of the game. Uh, yeah, like there's even segments in, say, I don't know if you played a Quake 4, where you're out in the daylight. The daylight sections of that game aren't scary at all. It's you're gonna mow through trash ads and mobs, and then get into the next point. What about you?
Right. Um, I'm trying to think. There's a few things I don't like in horror games. It's hard because I always want to bleed over into what bleed over. Let's talk about blood. Actually, that's a good topic. Gore. I think there's a place for gore in almost any type of horror. I'm not one of those people that says that gore porn shouldn't exist. But I do think it can be excessive, and I do think it can be used incorrectly. I think one of the most common places it's used incorrectly is in video games. You have to remember when you're playing a video game, it all still looks kind of cartoony. Even the nicest, newest video games still don't have that real feel to them. So when you have gore, especially repeated gore, like dismemberment, if you shoot someone, it all starts to look the same because it is the same. And I find it can be a very dulling experience, especially if the game leans into it. Um, so yeah, I would say excessive gore in horror games that's not used correctly is something that doesn't really turn my crank. Again, I've jumped all over cosmic horror, and I know if our channel ever catches on, these kind of statements are going to make me the disliked one of our duo. But cosmic horror has never really been my thing. I've never disliked Cthulhu, but I think it needs to be done properly. There's a reason why the original book worked, and that's because Cthulhu's in the background, and really the mystery and the horror and the tragedy behind the people who become obsessed with them is the upfront horror. Um, that's the other thing. I don't like pure black and white scenarios, good versus evil. I like for my villains to be tragic, and unfortunately, I didn't really bring that up in my good story side. But there's a reason why Elma works in Fear. She's not just an evil little girl. When you learn her backstory, you feel bad for her. In Dead Space, you know the people you're fighting are innocent, mostly innocent people who had no choice in what happened to them. You know that when you play Silent Hill, the characters are very flawed. Some of them are evil people, but a lot of them have more tragic, more convoluted backstories. Whereas you have something like Slender Man, and he's just pure evil. Um, I don't find that pure evil versus good to be very scary. Again, just like Doom literally makes you fight hell spawns. To me, that takes away from it because even though it's entertaining, it's literally just you're the good guy, they're the bad guy. And I've never found that very interesting in any type of genre, but in horror in particular, I think it's important to have some nuance. In the real world, a lot of the worst monsters who have ever existed, there's reasons they became that thing. And that's why they're fascinating. Now, I don't want to delve too much into that. We might talk about it in the books and the movies specifically. But yeah, the scariest thing about real world monsters is that they might be me or you.
Well, everybody thinks they're the hero in their story, right? Like nobody just does bad because they're completely evil. They get to that point through what might be like logical situations that progress them down that path.
Exactly. And it makes it so much more interesting. And to me, the games where, again, I'm repeating myself, but you have a character like Slender Man that's just this purely evil, malicious force. To me, I don't know why it almost breaks it for me because it just doesn't exist. It's not the way the world works, and it takes away from things. Now, we've already talked about this a lot because we both have made it clear we don't like it. I don't like cheap out of nowhere jump scares. I can take a jump scare that earns it. Think Bioshock Infinite with the silent, I believe they were called Silent Boys. That jump scare, when you're in the mansion and that little bugger sneaks up behind you where you're flicking the switch, that was earned. It was slow, build up tense moments where you had to avoid these buggers until you got to that switch and then one of them standing behind you and you simply can't avoid them. That was a well earned jump scare. Things like Five Nights at Freddy's are not well earned jump scares. They're built in, they just happen. Yeah, some skills involved, but they're cheap. I think if you're going to make a good horror game, you should learn how to build up dread. You should learn how to build up these scenarios better so that when the jump scares happen, they not only make sense as part of the plot, they make sense as something coming after you. If a werewolf's going to chase you down, you should have that sense of dread that something's stalking you. You should have that sense of dread that something's coming before it leaps out. Now, makes sense in some real world scenarios, something's just going to jump you and you're not going to know it's coming at all. But in a horror game, you should put some build up into it. All right, let's move on to what I believe is our final topic, and that is first person versus third person versus VR. Now, I'm going to let you start on this, Aegis, because I actually have no VR experience, but I can imagine what it's like. Tell me what you think about the three different options for horror and visuals.
Okay, so the furthest removed I think is third person. So a couple of my examples are like Dead Space or Bloodborne. So I think third person perspectives for video games are probably the least scary or the least like horrific because you can actually see your character. You have a wider field of view to actually see things in the environment, and it's you have a little more time to prepare for an attack. So, like within Dead Space, you can go down a hallway on the frigate, and you can see something maybe starting to round the corner, or you can see around a corner, for instance, and see a necromorph there, so you have a little more time to prepare. But if you think of a game like Outlast, for instance, you're playing this rinky-dink reporter with the camera, and you can only see what's directly in front of you, and there's no way to prepare for an enemy patrolling around the corner. So you're a little more exposed, a little more at risk. That's what I think. Now, if you take VR for instance, that's almost further like zooming down that tunnel of perspective because third person is exterior from the character, first person is from their eyes. VR is actually you, what feels like you are physically in the game. I'll take Resident Evil Biohazard for instance. That game, when I did play it briefly, oh man, it feels like you're actually in the house. They did a tremendous job with actually like creating like little creaks in the cracks in the floorboards, the enemies, just the horrific like details for the darkness. It made you actually feel like you had to explore more, but the visceral fear of not wanting to because there's this it's almost like this anxiety of not wanting to continue searching because you feel like your life is at risk. The funny thing with games and horror in general is people like them because in my mind it's almost a way for them to feel that fear and dread while not actually exposing like you directly to it. When I watch Halloween, it's a slasher. It can be scary sometimes the first time seeing it. I remember when I was a kid I watched Halloween H2O and it absolutely made me horrifically scared for months. But nowadays, I watch it and I feel safe because the characters are doomed, but I'm just watching them get slashed and cut up. But when I play VR, it really feels like I'm in the environment with the headset on, moving the character. I feel like I'm actually in direct control of the character. I feel like I'm in the house and I have to be completely evasive and watch it for ads. When I take off the headset, it's almost as if like I have to like become regrounded in like reality and like do something that's gonna take my mind off the game because it still has me like I'm still there. Do you understand what I mean? I think it's something you have to really experience yourself.
Right. And maybe for that reason, I'll avoid discussing VR. I can understand the more in your face feel of VR being more horrifying, but since I have no personal experience, I won't speak to it. Instead, I'll stick to speaking to third and first person points of view. I would say that I somewhat agree that first and third person perspective is a difference in the amount of fear you feel. Third person tends to be less scary, first person tends to be more in your face. But I do believe third person has its place. And I think that's more in games that want to set the environment, they want to set the tone, they want you to be immersed. Because in these games that do third person, very commonly the game world is designed to be unsettling. It's designed to make you feel that, not necessarily the full connection to your character, but just the horror of being what you're in. Again, think the original Resident Evil games and those forced camera views that made you look at the house. They made you see the windows. They made you see the creepy manor. Look at Silent Hill. The Silent Hills games want Silent Hills games. Silent Hill games. Sorry, the Silent Hill games want you to see the game world. They want you to see the mist. They want you to see the decrepit. They want to see the broken down stuff that laces the world. They want you to see the things beside you when you're walking past things like cells and all the arms are reaching out to try to grab you. Um, they want you to see that kind of stuff that it's not that you wouldn't see it in first person, but you would get less of a overarching feel. Dead Space does the same thing. They want you to see everything. When you step out into space, they want you to have that sense of immersion of, wow, I'm in space. But when things get in your face and stuff, it tends to not work as well in those games. Because, like you said, when a necromorph jumps at you, you're still a good 3 feet back from the necromorph. And that's where I think that first person perspective works better. I think what happens is when you get games like Fear and it's in first person point of view, having Elma come right up in your face is the fear of that game. Sorry, fear, not the fear meaning fear, fear not the title. It's what causes that sense of dread and uncertainty. Its overworld, while scary, is not as detailed as the other games I mentioned. So to me, like that's the difference. Is horror games that want to be in your face, that want that tension from that side, tend to be first person, while games that want you to focus on the environment, tone, sense of dread tend to be third person. Now, is there anything else you want to say on this topic, Aegis?
So I remember you touched on Silent Hill there, and it's actually funny because back in 2014, Kojima actually really like released what I think is one of the best, what was actually hoped to be one of the best horror games. Actually, it was Silent Hill PT, which is just basically it translates to playable trailer. So it was a short demo. Unfortunately, it was only a demo, but you were in a first-person view in what would have been a Silent Hill game. Now you take place in a house and it's basically two corridors, two hallways that are it's like an L shape. You have a bathroom, a short little like entrance area with a door that leads to the outside, and then a set of stairs that leads down to what scripts you back to the start. And in some instances, it's dark. In some instances, it's light. Now, each time you pass through the hallway, you have to trigger an event to happen to get to the next part. Whether that's looking at a reflection in the mirror in the bathroom, or looking up in the rafters to see something moving or a chandelier swinging. I don't know if you've played it, but my friends actually got me to play it for my birthday because it came out around that time, and everybody played it, and I was the last one to play it. I didn't see the game, and they had a really good time laughing at me just being completely like scared and like jump scared by things happening, just creepy, eerie things happening in that game. And I think what made it work is one of the big things is it's not just one continuous hallway. It's there's that separation when you round the corner. It's almost like a second area, and
Right.
there's there's more just than the one continuous hallway where they can actually have you round the corner, and there can be like a spirit there that can jump scare you, which depending on the section of the demo you're in, it can be unexpected, which it actually is unexpected. Nothing creepier. Like it's commonplace in movies. I'll take an instance where the character is in the bathroom. They're looking at the mirror. They look down to wash their face, and they look up again, and someone or something is there. And you almost expect that nowadays, where they look in the mirror. You expect that occurrence to happen. The same thing happens in this, but the mirror is broken, and you look back, and there's something in the tub, and even though you do expect it, it's still like, huh, gotcha, jump scare.
Right. And I think that the PT example, I have played it, is a very good example of the variance between third and first person. The old Silent Hill games were all third person, and they went much more for tone, visual, and environmental horror. Um, and again, the ghastliness of the enemies you were going up against. One of the Silent Hill games focused in on it would identify what you seemed to react to most horrified, and it would modify what you were seeing to adapt to that. Um, but the Silent Hill games were always very dread, tone, feel, environment based. And what I got from PT, which was the same producer, same company, was a much more in your face feel. Like you said, you had ghosts coming at you, you had the ghost staring down at you, you had the fetus that was in the bathroom. These things were all much more in your face than the old Silent Hills, and it worked because they changed the horror in a way that still felt Silent Hill, but it was much more in your face. And I don't think if that version of Silent Hill PT had been third person, it would have worked anywhere near as well. So I think it's an interesting example of two games in the same storyline or the same overarching game series that are very different. And it's the same thing as with Biohazard. The old Resident Evils were very much tone. They were less in your face horror versus the very visual, grimy, disturbing game that came out in the form of Biohazard, which hilariously was named Resident Evil in Japan. Um, that game was much more gruesome, forcing you to eat disgusting things, forcing you to have your own arm cut off in front of you, having people screaming in your face, the gunk creatures. It was a very different Resident Evil game that kept the same things like the puzzle solving, that kept the same save files as the old games. Inventory. Everyone loves inventory for some reason in Resident Evil, but the actual horror was quite a bit different in tone from the old games. So I think that was interesting to bring up, Aegis. And I'm sorry to cut in, but I do think that was a good example. Now, unfortunately, I think we do need to cut it off today. My upstairs neighbors have shown up. I'm sure some of you who have good headphones, which again helps you with horror games. Good headphones means that you're going to hear all the creaks and bangs and crashes throughout the game. You probably noticed you can hear the creaks and crashes and bangs in the background of my audio. So I think it's time we say goodbye and we end it for this afternoon. We'll be back next time to talk horror and movies and horror and books. Aegis, did you have anything else you wanted to say to everybody, or did we want to cut it off here?
Uh, I just have a recommendation. If you guys haven't played Bloodborne or Dead Space, definitely dive into both of them. If you can try and download PT, play that through. I don't think you can anymore.
You can't.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's
that's
gone.
unfortunate. But I'm hoping to actually release a new Silent Hill game or something. Just briefly, I'll mention before we go that it's rumored that there's going to actually be a new game that's akin to Dead Space made by the old developers. I forget what it's called, but I think it was rumored or mentioned at the Games Awards this past couple days. And I really hope that's true, and I really hope that comes out in the next year or so.
It keeps being brought up. I know there was rumor it was going to be shown during the summer as well. Not sure what it is. I'm excited to hear about it. Just wanted to say one more thing, guys. even though I know I kind of chipped on a few indie games throughout this discussion, I do like supporting the little guy. I do think things can be done well. I think Scott Cawthorn, I think he did well for himself in what he did. So please, if that kind of horror works for you, support the little guys. They're creative. They obviously love what they do. If those kind of horror games scare you, or if you even just like the plot of them, check them out. They need the money more than the big guys do. That's all I've got, Aegis.
100%. Okay, well, that's everything, Winter. I think we can kind of cap it off there. So thanks for tuning in, guys. We really appreciate you taking the time. I'm Gilded, and this is Winter, and we're signing off.
Have a good evening, everybody.